Hello, this is the third talk looking at the history of the Mongol invasions into the Near East. In the first two talks, we looked at the various waves of Mongol invasions taking place in the early 1220s and 1230s, which brought much of the Near East under Mongol control. We also looked at how the Mongols in the 1240s invaded Anatolia, or at this time the Seljuk Sultanate, and forced the region to accept Mongol hegemony. In this talk, we're going to be looking at the events from the year 1245 through to the year 1260. Well, in the late 1240s, and for much of the 1250s, the Mongol Empire didn't conduct many substantial conquests in the Near Eastern region. There were various wars and invasions, but by and large the Mongols didn't take a great deal of territory. They raided parts of the Ayyubid Empire, they attacked the Abbasid Caliphate, but in neither case were they able to make significant gains. There was also ongoing diplomacy with the Byzantine Empire about whether the Byzantines should submit, but this didn't take place, at least not during these years. But then in 1252, the current Mongol Great Khan in Mongolia sent his brother, Hulegu, with an enormous army into the Near East. Now, we're not entirely sure how big Hulegu's forces were, but it seems likely that they were in excess of 100,000 troops. And given that most armies in the Near East rarely get much larger than about 10 to 15,000 troops in this era, that gives an idea of just how substantial these forces were. And so Hulegu staged his advance and he crossed into the Near East in 1256 and then began to attack any regions essentially that either hadn't been conquered by the Mongol Empire or hadn't submitted to the Mongol Empire. And so his first target were the various castles in Persia controlled by the Nizaris, a Shia Islamic sect known by a nickname in the West at least as the Assassins. He then advanced further westwards, and then in 1258 he began an assault on the city of Baghdad, which of course was the capital city of the Abbasid Caliphate, an enormous metropolis in the region. And ultimately Hulegu's forces did conquer Baghdad with enormous loss of life and destruction to the city. He also ordered the execution of the Abbasid Caliph. His armies then advanced after the conquest of Baghdad further north, heading towards Syria. Now, a bit of background here is that in 1256, as part of his preparation for his advance into the Near East, Hulegu demanded that the region's current commander, a commander called Baichu, should move westwards out of the Caucasus, where his own army was stationed, and into Anatolia, so that the good grazing land in the Caucasus could be used by Hulegu's army. And so Baichu moved west into Anatolia. He was resisted by the Seljuk Sultanate, which didn't want him to station his army in its territory. Of course, the Seljuk Sultanate was a Mongol client state by this time. But they tried to resist the movement of Baichu and his army into their territory and were then decisively defeated by Baichu in battle. So, in the late 1250s, Hulegu then moved north, swinging north of the Syrian desert and into the eastern districts of the Ayyubid Empire. And you may remember from the previous talk, the Ayyubid Empire is the empire that was initially founded by Saladin in the late 12th century. Well, the Mongols advanced into the Jazira, the Ayyubid territories in that area, and then crossed the Euphrates River and lay siege to the major city of Aleppo, which they take very swiftly, again with enormous loss of life. And it's during the preparatory stages of this siege that one of the Crusader states, so a bit of background, the Crusader states were states created by the First Crusade at the end of the 11th century, and by this stage the northernmost Crusader state was the Principality of Antioch. Well, as far as the ruler of the Principality of Antioch is concerned, it's clear the Mongols are now right on his frontier. He has no chance of defeating them, and so he submits to Mongol overlordship, much to the horror of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the larger and more powerful of the Crusader states. So, with the conquest of Aleppo, Hulegu then sends another force under a commander called Kiburka south to conquer Damascus, which yields itself without a fight, and this effectively signals the end of the Ayyubid Empire, which now has lost its remaining territories, and a few remaining Ayyubid leaders soon align themselves with the Mongol Empire because it's clear that there's no point to offering further resistance. And so I just want to pause here in the early months of 1260 because these events really do mark the furthest and greatest extent of the Mongol conquests in the Near East. By this stage, the Mongols control, either directly or through client states, the greater part of the Near East. It's also in 1260 that the Byzantines form an alliance with the Mongols, which may well be a treaty of submission. That's not entirely clear. But nonetheless, the region is now very much aligned with the Mongol Empire. Very few powers now remain independent. Among the few that do are the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the southernmost Crusader state, which tries to sort of conduct negotiations with the Mongols without actually submitting, although it's not clear how long the Kingdom of Jerusalem was expecting to hold out, given the size of the Mongol army. But there's another territory as well that's also remaining independent and refusing to submit to Mongol hegemony, and that is the Mamluk Empire of Egypt. Now, a bit of background on the Mamluk Empire of Egypt. Now, Egypt, up until 1250, was part of the Ayyubid Empire, the empire created by Saladin. But a significant portion of the Ayyubid Empire's armed forces were traditionally made up of Mamluks. And Mamluks were enslaved people brought to Egypt by merchants, often from the Black Sea region, who were then purchased by the Ayyubids and then raised to be elite soldiers. Now, the Mamluks grew in number over time, and then during another crusading expedition in 1250 into Egypt, the Mamluks were instrumental in the defeat of that crusading force. And these events seem to have caused the Mamluks to realise that they had significant power in their own right. And so this, plus an awkward moment of succession within the Ayyubid Sultanate, led the Mamluks firstly to murder the Ayyubid Sultan and then take power for themselves in Egypt. And they were to become an extremely powerful empire in later decades, but they're also the power that has to decide what they're going to do in the face of the Mongol invasions into Syria. And this is the important point, because when the Mongols send emissaries to the Mamluks demanding their submission, the Mamluks do not submit. Instead, they kill the Mongol envoys, and in doing so, naturally, they signal that they are determined to resist. And because they haven't just sent their envoys away, they've actually killed them, they know they're going to face invasion. And so this crucial moment of diplomacy sets up much of what happens next, and that will be covered in the next talk.